Thousands of veterans every year are saddled with medical debt, many turned over to collection agencies after trips to the emergency room. A new KARE 11 investigation discovers it's happening because the VA does not consistently apply its own rules. Investigative reporter AJ Legault has the story.
It was a tough night.
When you're parents of a newborn, there can be a lot of sleepless nights.
That's right.
But for Ben and Gretchen Krause, there is one night back in February that really stands out.
The idea of losing him, Ben, with a little baby here, really scary.
Ben began experiencing severe chest pain.
I felt like my chest was about to pop.
And had trouble breathing,
Baby here, and
fearing her husband was having a heart attack.
I remember he said, "Something's wrong, something's wrong."
Gretchen drove the family a mile to the nearest emergency room at Woodwinds. They were here for 9 hours. Doctors determined it was not a heart attack, but instead an extreme form of stress, exacerbated by a recent death in the family.
The technical term for it is malignant hypertension with neurological and cardiovascular complications. Couldn't dial back the stress from what was going on in the grief process.
A veteran, Ben expected the Minneapolis VA would pick up the $6,000 ER bill. He was mistaken.
I got a letter in the mail saying they were going to deny me.
Why? The letter says it was because the treatment provided does not meet the prudent layperson definition of an emergency.
Apparently a prudent, normal guy wouldn't have gone to the emergency room if they were experiencing chest pains like I was.
Ben's case raises the question, what does the VA believe is a prudent layperson's definition of an emergency? We looked to the VA's prudent layperson fact sheet. It describes someone with an average knowledge of health who believes failure to obtain immediate medical care could result in placing the patient's health in serious jeopardy.
I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse. I know when to go to the ER. You go to the ER when someone is in distress, and he was in distress.
Now it's time you know something else about Ben. He's one of the most prominent veterans' rights attorneys in the nation.
With bad faith insurance adjudication, that's against the law.
Ben believes in his case, the VA acted in bad faith. Back to the VA's own prudent layperson fact sheet. Under case example A, it describes a patient going to the ER complaining of chest pain, but given a diagnosis of mild gastric irritation. But because chest pain is a potentially serious problem, it, quote, clearly falls into the category of what any prudent layperson would consider an appropriate use of the emergency department.
Right.
This is almost, when you look at it, this is almost verbatim your case.
Right. It's black and white, and it's case example A.
We wanted to know, is Ben's an isolated case or a systemic pattern of dubious denials?
If it happened to me, I guarantee it's happening to thousands of veterans nationwide.
He's right. During a congressional hearing last year,
VA is many times forced to deny a significant number of emergency treatment claims.
This VA undersecretary submitted a written statement admitting in just 1 year, 98,000 veterans had their claim denied because the VA determined it was not an emergency. And here's the most important part. Quote, many of these denials are the result of inconsistent application of the prudent layperson standard.
It's absurd.
Ben wrote about his experience on his popular veterans blog, serving notice to the VA that he was working with KARE 11 to get to the bottom of his imprudent VA denial.
The second that they realize that somebody is looking into it, and somebody with an ability to make it into a national story, once they realize that, then they called and said, oh, sorry, we made a mistake. We're going to take care of it now.
Well, Minneapolis VA officials refused to be interviewed for this story, but in an email, they blamed a coding error by the non-VA emergency room for the denial. They said they didn't yet have all of Ben's records when that denial was issued, but as you heard, they are now approving it. A Minnesota veteran turned over to collections after the VA refuses to pay for medical care they instructed him to get. Investigative reporter AJ Legault continues to dig into the VA's bizarre refusals to pay for veterans' emergency room treatment.
It's a great place to go get care. I had no complaints at all.
Army veteran Bob Ramsey wanted that point about the Minneapolis VA's actual medical care made crystal clear. But he also believes VA bureaucracy did him wrong.
Exactly.
Bob now works as a dispatcher for a trucking company after years as a tank mechanic for Uncle Sam.
Some days, if I have to walk a lot, my knee will swell up.
His knees are shot.
Right when I'll have to be replaced eventually.
In 2015, he needed a knee surgery, but the wait time at the Minneapolis VA was too long. So he was approved for the Veterans Choice Program that President Obama signed into law, allowing veterans facing lengthy VA delays to get care at private hospitals. Bob's surgery was done at Maple Grove.
So I got that done and thought everything would be okay.
Bob has a blood disorder, so he was warned if he had any unusual pain after surgery not to ignore it.
Because I could have a blood clot.
About a week after his surgery at Maple Grove, Bob had growing pain in his calf, so called the Minneapolis VA, asking if he should come in to their ER. He says he spoke with the nurse on duty.
And she said, well, you should go in and be seen right away, but you should go back to where you had the surgery. And so that's what I did.
You can probably guess what happens next.
Right there.
Bob got a letter in the mail from the Minneapolis VA refusing to pay for his ER visit because he could have gone to the VA.
VA or federal facility was available to provide services. Claim denied. I called for advice, to ask what they want me to do. They told me what to do. I did what they told me to do, and then they refused to pay.
Bob says he tried reasoning with the VA for nearly a year.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, his bill from Maple Grove was turned over to a collection agency.
They'll continue to call and harass you. You know, this is your bill. You should get the service. You should pay for it. You know, you're a bad person because you didn't pay your bills.
Bob is not alone. During a congressional hearing last year,
VA is many times forced to deny a significant number of emergency treatment claims.
this VA undersecretary testified that in just 1 year, the VA denied payment of $2.6 billion for veterans' ER bills. 140,000 claims were denied because a VA facility was determined to have been available. Bob's story raises serious questions about the fairness and validity of those denials affecting veterans all across the nation.
And I thought, well, I might as well speak up, because if we don't speak up, no one's going to listen.
Apparently, the Minneapolis VA is now listening. One day after KARE 11 contacted them asking about Bob's denial, he got this voicemail from VA official Mike Rosecrans.
Hey, I just want you to know that the claims, the ER emergent care claims, will be processed today for payment.
Bob wonders why it took a call from a reporter for the VA to do what's right.
Yeah, that's bureaucracy.
Well, the Minneapolis VA sent us a statement that said, in part, thanks for bringing this issue to our attention. This was an error on our part, and Bob's claim is being processed for payment.
You know, it's happened so many times on stories that you have looked into, and it's so frustrating that it takes a call like that to get action. And the bill wasn't even that big for an emergency room bill.
No, Bob's bill was only about $400, but we have heard from other veterans who've gotten some similarly questionable denials where it's been tens of thousands of dollars. As we know, ER bills can really start racking up pretty fast.
He said, it's terrible, terrible pain, and you have to get relief.
Tonight, an elderly veteran dealing with a potentially life-threatening condition gets what he calls a slap in the face from the VA. Thank you for joining us tonight. The veteran claims the VA is refusing to pay his emergency medical bill.
A.J. Legault has been investigating the VA for several years now, and tonight, a new chapter in his continuing look at a pattern of denial.
A tranquil existence on the shore of Lake Pokegama in northern Minnesota is how 78-year-old Army veteran Jerry Malwitz expected to spend his golden years.
I don't want to destroy it by this type of garbage.
The garbage is medical bills Jerry says he should not owe.
I don't deserve this.
And a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs saying claim denied.
Treatment provided does not meet the prudent layperson's definition of an emergency.
Drafted by Uncle Sam in the early 1960s, Jerry receives all of his medical care through the VA. But last August, a catheter he has, due to an enlarged prostate, got plugged.
Well, I was half crazy with the pain. I was moaning and groaning.
It was 8 o'clock at night, and the nearest VA hospital in St. Cloud was 140 miles away.
And I needed help now. I mean, it hurt. My heart attack was nothing compared to that urinary retention.
Jerry's wife rushed him to the Grand Rapids emergency room.
The doctor said your urinary retention hurts as bad as a woman having a baby. I'm not a woman. But I told the doctor the pain I had was as tough as if I had triplets.
Veterans who get their medical care from the VA can go to an outside hospital in an emergency, and the VA is supposed to pay the portion not covered by other insurance. But remember, the VA is trying to stick Jerry with a bill, claiming what he had was not even a true emergency.
And I know what an emergency is. It isn't because you got a hangnail on your big toe.
Jerry says maybe the VA should try reading how the U.S. Department of Health describes urinary retention as a potentially life-threatening medical condition that requires immediate emergency treatment.
Hurts.
What also hurts is the calls from debt collectors and the threat of a ruined credit rating. Jerry says he's lost track of the time he's spent unsuccessfully trying to get the VA to reconsider his denial.
Hours. Hours. I wake up at night and think of this. Do I deserve that?
So far, the Department of Veterans Affairs refuses to respond to our direct questions about Jerry's case and those of a number of other veterans with similar denials. Is it faster to just deny?
Always.
Tonight, a VA insider speaks out, exposing how he says a quota system is sticking veterans with emergency medical bills they don't truly owe.
It is the latest in a KARE 11 investigation into whether the VA is honoring our nation's contract to care for veterans. Here's investigative reporter AJ Legault with a pattern of denial.
I remember he said, something's wrong, something's wrong.
Fearing her husband Ben was having a heart attack,
Okay.
Gretchen Krause rushed him to the nearest ER.
It felt like my chest was about to pop.
Bob Ramsey was concerned he might have clots caused by a blood disorder, so also went to a nearby emergency room.
And I was always warned if I had any issues with my leg pain, things like that, that I should be seen immediately.
Bob and Ben are both veterans, both qualified for the VA to pay for their care at a non-VA hospital in an emergency. But the VA refused, sending them denial letters.
I would have had to pay $6,000, over $6,000 out of my own pocket.
In both cases, the Minneapolis VA did an about-face once KARE 11 began investigating, admitting the denials were mistakes and agreeing to pay.
Hey, Bob.
Here's a voicemail a VA official left Bob.
The ER emergent care claims will be processed today for payment.
The second that they realize that somebody's looking into it, and somebody with an ability to make it into a national story, once they realized that, then they called and said, oh, sorry, we made a mistake. We're going to take care of it now.
But how did the mistaken denials happen in the first place? Our search for answers led us to a VA employee named Joe.
Correct.
He has a painful confession to make.
It's been weighing on me a lot.
When we met Joe, he was working as a voucher examiner for the VA's Office of Community Care. That's the office that either approves or denies emergency treatment claims like Bob's and Ben's.
A Minnesota veteran turned over to collections after
He'd seen our reports and told us he believes there are a lot more veterans out there stuck with emergency medical bills the VA should have paid.
You know for a 100% fact that there are claims being done incorrectly?
Yes.
Because you've done them incorrectly.
Yes.
An admission in direct conflict with Joe's own 2016 VA employee performance appraisal. In glowing terms, it claims he's an exceptional employee who's accurate an incredible 99% of the time.
Is that true?
Probably not.
Joe says they don't really monitor errors. What they do track and focus on is how many claims examiners complete each hour.
We are accountable for speed, and the faster you are, your performance goes up.
So just how fast does the VA expect examiners like Joe to be when they go through a veteran's often complicated emergency medical bill claim? Joe's performance review spells it out. To get an exceptional employee rating, the target for handling claims like Ben and Bob's is 22 an hour. Let's do some math. If an examiner has 60 minutes to review 22 claims, that means on average less than 3 minutes spent reviewing each one. 3 minutes to determine whether it was a real emergency, service-connected, covered by other insurance, or if they should have gone to a VA hospital instead.
We were told to pick and click and get them moving.
This Government Accountability Office report from 2014 backs up what Joe is saying in surprising detail. It found all the VA reports on emergency care claims focus on timeliness rather than the appropriateness of VA facilities' denial of such claims.
Are claims being denied unfairly because you and other claims examiners are not reading them thoroughly?
Yes.
And here's where the VA's focus on speed goes even further off the rails. Joe says it's a lot faster to deny a veteran's claim than to go through all the steps it takes to approve it.
Look for a reason to deny it. It's the fastest way to get your numbers.
In a statement, the Department of Veterans Affairs denied it has quotas, saying employees have a performance plan that measures production standards, effectiveness, quality, and customer service. This issue of emergency treatment claims came up at a congressional hearing last year.
VA is many times forced to deny a significant number of emergency treatment claims.
Why? VA told Congress in this statement it's because determination of these claims is nuanced and unclear for veterans. So how many denials are there? KARE 11 crunched 2.5 years worth of VA data and found in the VA Midwest network, which includes Minnesota, 52% of all emergency medical claims are denied. That's $65 million forced back onto veterans to pay. Nationwide, it adds up to $2.6 billion in just 1 year, leaving this VA insider to wonder how many veterans are being saddled with bills they should not owe.
Sometimes what's being denied obviously should be approved.
Yes.
That's a damning claim.
Yes.
Joe, who requested we not use his last name, no longer works as a claims examiner, but still works in a different position for the Department of Veterans Affairs. And to fact check what he was telling us, I spoke with two other people who worked with Joe as VA claims examiners, and they back up what he says, that the focus is all about speed and meeting the quota, or as the VA labels it, the production standard, as opposed to ensuring veterans' cases are handled thoroughly and fairly.
Well, a powerful member of Congress today is calling for a federal investigation in response to a KARE 11 investigation.
Last night we reported how the VA was wrongly sticking veterans with medical bills they should not owe. And A.J. Legault joining us with the latest in his continuing investigation.
Yeah, Randy, today Congressman Tim Walz, the ranking member of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, said what he'd seen in our reports is unacceptable. And the Inspector General needs to step in and determine how widespread this pattern of denials truly is.
And when you point out a story like I saw that you ran, I think it warrants looking at it.
Congressman Tim Walz says he'd watched KARE 11's investigation that uncovered veterans being saddled with medical debt they should not owe after rushing to non-VA ERs during a medical emergency.
The VA denied my claim, saying I was, more or less imprudent.
Some even had their bills turned over to collection agencies.
I paid the bill because it was already in collection. I didn't want that hurting my credit any more than what it already had.
We're looking into it. I think after your report, we're going to ask, we'll ask the IG, as we always do, to look in a little deeper, see if this is systemic, and try and figure out how deep it goes.
A whistleblower tells KARE 11 improper denials are systemic because VA staffers are pressured to review complex files in just minutes in order to meet their required quota, or as the VA labels it, production standards.
We were told to pick and click and get them moving.
You know for a 100% fact that there are claims being done incorrectly.
Yes.
Because you've done them incorrectly.
Yes.
Let's figure out if this is a problem either in staffing or if there is a cultural issue forcing quantity or look good over actually being good. We should find that out.
Well, as you heard, Congressman Walz is asking for the Inspector General to step in. I can tell you this investigation has struck a chord with a lot of veterans and their families. My inbox filling up with emails from vets across the country who claim they too have had their emergency medical bills improperly denied.
If it wasn't for AJ and KARE 11, I'd be fighting this battle for who knows how long.
A KARE 11 investigation continues to make a difference in the lives of our nation's service members. Thanks for joining us tonight. We've been exposing how veterans are being saddled with medical debt they should not owe, some of it even turned over to collection agencies after trips to the emergency room.
The VA is now offering apologies and backtracking on denials for some of the veterans whose stories we've shared. Here's investigative reporter AJ Legault with the latest in his series, A Pattern of Denial.
I never say I came home, I came back.
Rocky Waite came back from Vietnam to Little Canada, Minnesota.
This is where my daughter lives.
More than 50 years ago. An Army medic, what he saw is still with him.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories.
It's part of what drove him to help his town build and dedicate a Veterans Memorial Park.
And I might be a little bit prejudiced, but I think it's the best one in Minnesota.
A proud veteran with a 100% service-connected disability.
I'm right over here.
He never expected to be fighting again in his old age with the federal agency charged with caring for those who've served.
They're the Veterans Administration, but they're not veteran-friendly.
For the 71-year-old, it's a battle that began with a large kidney stone.
The pain just got to be excruciating.
He called the Minneapolis VA and was told to go to the nearest ER. He had emergency surgery at St. John's and was told in 10 days he needed a stent removed. Following protocol, he called the VA nurses hotline, asking if the stent should be removed at the VA or back at the private hospital. His VA records clearly show he was instructed to go back to St. John's.
I took their advice and went, had the procedure done. Next thing I got was a denial letter from the VA saying I didn't follow protocol.
Despite doing everything right, Rocky was stuck with a $1,200 bill.
So I did as I was told. I don't know how else you could do it.
He appealed and was again denied. Then he saw something that really made him mad.
And then I was watching the television and spotted a story on KARE 11.
Our investigation exposing other veterans with wrongful ER bill denials. He emailed us his records.
This one came in from Mr. Rocky Waite.
And we mentioned his case on air.
Sticking this veteran with a $1,200 bill. So he's now asking the question, hey, what should I do?
The very next day,
kind of almost a miracle.
Rocky got a voicemail from a VA official.
So we'll get that paid for probably today. I'm sorry about the hassle you went through.
Payment and apology. Unlike Vietnam, this is a battle Rocky can now forget.
If it hadn't been for KARE 11, I'd have still been fighting this battle, and it could go on for years with these people.
In response to our reporting on wrongful ER denials, Senator Klobuchar tells me she'll be speaking directly with VA Secretary Shulkin this week.
It makes me think that they need to change their process, and that is what I'll be talking to the Secretary about.
It's obviously an official investigation.
Yeah, absolutely. Congressman Walz actually has asked the Inspector General to step in and investigate, and we'd sent Rocky's documents and story to Congressman Walz last week, and that's been included for the Inspector General's official investigation, his story.
Well, it's so lucky he kept those records. I imagine there are a lot of veterans that maybe can't find them, they misplaced them. I mean,
he knew
had
how to get them.
Right,
he was right on top of everything, and still was like, that's why he was throwing his hands in the air going, what am I supposed to do?
Well, thanks.
Well, he did everything right, and you just helped him get to where he needed to be.
Hey, that's what we're here for.
That's right. Well, first at 6, KARE 11 investigates.
As I followed your story on the news, and I just sat there and thought, hello, this is the same thing that we've been tangling with.
For several months now, KARE 11 Investigates has been exposing the Department of Veterans Affairs sticking veterans with emergency medical bills they should not owe.
New tonight, how one elderly Minnesota man and a small team of attorneys took on the VA and won a precedent-setting case that could put billions of dollars back into veterans' pockets. Here's investigative reporter AJ Legault with the latest in his series of reports, A Pattern of Denial.
This is one of many boxes that we have for Mr. Staub's case.
When you think legal cases, with national, multi-billion-dollar implications,
7 years and several boxes of these.
a tiny law office in St. Cloud, Minnesota is probably not what you imagine, as even attorney Jackie Shu admits.
It truly, really is a Davy and Goliath story.
In this story, Goliath is the Department of Veterans Affairs. David is not a boy, although Richard Staub was a young man when he served in the Air Force in Korea. He's now elderly and in such failing health, he could not be interviewed.
Mr. Staub is just a gentle soul who was kind of shy, very humble, living on a fixed income in an apartment on the east side of St. Cloud.
In 2010, Mr. Staub suffered a heart attack and stroke and was treated at St. Cloud Hospital. Medicare picked up some of the cost, but he was still left with $48,000 in bills, which he submitted to the St. Cloud VA for payment. He was denied.
The denial was based upon the internal rule that the VA had been enforcing since 2010.
That internal rule required veterans to have no other health insurance, including Medicaid, in order for the VA to pay. But there's a problem.
In violation of U.S. law.
Their regulation violates federal law.
That is correct.
The Veterans Emergency Care Fairness Act, passed by Congress in 2009, requires the VA to pay for emergency care for which a qualified veteran is personally liable. No mention of other insurance being a prohibition.
It is pretty cut and dry.
Little did Jackie know when she took the Staub case pro bono that it would become a 7-year legal battle filled with denials and lost appeals, until ultimately this year, a federal court of appeals ruled the VA's internal regulation was wholly inconsistent with federal law, and Mr. Staub was entitled to reimbursement. The VA appealed that ruling until, in a congressional hearing in June, the VA secretary made a surprise announcement.
I have decided to voluntarily withdraw the appeal to the Staub case.
Oh, that's great news, Mr. Secretary.
By the VA's own estimates, this Minnesota veterans case will impact the lives of hundreds of thousands of other veterans. VA is now liable to pay 370,000 previously denied claims, totaling more than $2 billion.
And this is one of those where you say, yeah, there truly is a good, and right is right, and the decision was right, and we did good.
They certainly did do good. Jackie Shu is actually recognized as Attorney of the Year by the Minnesota Bar for her work on that case. Here's the kicker, though. Despite dropping their appeal, the VA has still not paid Mr. Staub, who, as we said, is in failing health. And if he passes first, the VA's obligation to reimburse dies with him, leaving nothing for his family.
The KARE 11 investigation getting results after repeated reports exposing how the VA was wrongly sticking veterans with medical bills they should not owe. A powerful member of Congress called for a federal investigation.
Yeah, we've now learned the Inspector General is stepping in and launching a nationwide review. AJ Legault has the latest on his continuing investigation, a pattern of denial.
Federal law says in an emergency, qualified veterans can go to the closest emergency room, and the VA will pay the bill. They don't have to drive miles out of the way to go to a VA hospital. But KARE's investigation found case
I don't deserve this
after case.
Whether the VA should pay this claim is black and white.
After case.
The bill is over $1,200.
Where the VA denied the claims, leaving veterans on the hook for bills they should not owe. Some, like Bob Ramsey, were even turned over to collection agencies.
So I paid the bill because it was already in collection. I didn't want that hurting my credit any more than what it already had.
When we questioned the VA about individual denials, in several cases, they've quickly reversed course, calling the vets to apologize.
So we'll get that paid for probably today. I'm sorry about the hassle you went through.
But why are the improper denials happening? This VA insider told KARE the problem is systemic because VA staffers are pressured to review complex files in just minutes in order to meet their required quota, or as the VA labels it, production standards.
We were told to pick and click and get them moving.
You know for a 100% fact that there are claims being done incorrectly.
Yes.
Because you've done them incorrectly.
Yes.
When you point out a story like I saw that you ran, I think it warrants looking at it.
Congressman Wall said after seeing that report, the federal government needed to step in and investigate.
See if this is systemic and try and figure out how deep it goes.
The VA Inspector General has now told Representative Walz that based on what they found in their preliminary investigation, they've decided to expand their investigation to a national scope. KARE obtained this letter where the OIG says it will be looking into whether claims are being incorrectly denied due to production standards.
We'll find out how widespread this is.
Well, since we started this investigation, we've heard from veterans all across the country who've said this happened to me too. From what we're seeing, it appears a wholesale audit needs to be done of the tens of thousands of ER bill denials that happen each year. just to ensure our nation is living up to its promise to care for those who've served.
Tonight, the latest in the KARE 11 investigation, a pattern of denial.
Was VA following its own rules?
No, that was the point. They weren't following their own criteria. They weren't following their own requirements and policies.
A federal government investigator describing how the VA was sticking veterans with emergency bills they should not owe. Those findings mirror what KARE 11 Investigates has been exposing for months.
Investigative reporter AJ Legault joins us with the latest. AJ?
Yeah, when you're having an emergency health situation, you go to the nearest ER. If you're a qualified veteran, the law says the VA has to pay. But our investigation found all too often that's not happening. And we now know the government has known all about the problem for years.
Some veterans were likely billed for care that VA should have paid for.
It's 2014, and Government Accountability Office investigator Randy Williamson is testifying before Congress.
It was pretty much a pattern of a lot of errors.
Describing the GAO's findings that the Department of Veterans Affairs was mishandling emergency medical bill claims.
We found that basically VA was doing a very poor job, and they were erroneously denying claims.
His investigation found VA staffers breaking rules, leaving veterans financially liable for bills VA should have paid.
20% of the cases we looked at were wrong, were denied inappropriately.
Is that an acceptable error rate?
Heavens no, it's not.
Fast forward 3 years, and KARE 11's investigation
I don't deserve this.
is finding the same problems.
Whether the VA should pay this claim is black and white.
In case
The bill is over $1,200.
after case
I was getting collection calls.
after case.
Is the expectation that this issue was being fixed?
That was the expectation.
The GAO found clerks were denying medical bills without a qualified clinician reviewing them.
No, they were just denying it.
Really?
Williamson documented how the VA would give vets pre-approval to go to an outside hospital, then deny their claim as unauthorized. Exactly what we found still happening to vets like Bob Ramsey.
I called for advice, to ask what they want me to do. They told me what to do. I did what they told me to do, and then they refused to pay.
3 years.
This whistleblower told KARE 11 it's happening because to meet VA performance goals, employees have just minutes to review claims.
Are claims being denied unfairly because you and other claims examiners are not reading them thoroughly?
Yes. We were told to pick and click and get them moving.
The GAO found VA management only tracking how quickly claims were done without checking if they were done correctly.
Nobody was checking?
Nobody was checking.
And there's more at stake than veterans getting stuck with bills they don't owe. Fearing those bills, GAO found veterans putting their lives at risk by bypassing the closest emergency room to drive miles to the VA, including one vet with a gunshot wound.
When his wife drove him to a veterans hospital 100 miles away rather than go to the nearest facility in the community.
Why?
Because the veteran thought that he would be on the hook for the bill.
The GAO report made 12 recommendations, but Williamson told Congress back in 2014 he was concerned VA was not fully implementing them.
It's not completely fixed.
3 years later, CARE's investigation proves that, finding veterans like Jerry Malwitz
And then this number
still
here.
falling victim to VA's pattern of improper denials.
I wake up at night and think of this. Do I deserve that?
In the wake of our reporting, the VA Inspector General told Congress they were launching a nationwide investigation. If they're looking for a roadmap to the problem, they won't have to search much further than that government report from just 3 years ago. You can read it for yourself on KARE11.com.
This is my Class A uniform jacket.
You can learn a lot about a soldier by looking at their dress uniform.
You can tell their rank.
Iraq War Army veteran David Riggs first put his on in 1985.
This one here is a marksman's badge. It's actually a story in a uniform jacket.
And if a ribbon existed for good health, the 55-year-old veteran likely deserves one.
Very seldom, if ever, went to the doctor's office for anything.
But his good health is now costing him.
$12,186.
Ginger is David's wife.
But he wasn't raised to let's run to the doctor if I sneeze.
Unless it was life-threatening, you didn't do anything for it except keep it from bleeding and keep on going.
So when he was hurting so bad last July, he says he could not even stand, you know it was bad.
And I was in so much pain, I didn't know which way to turn.
Ginger called 911 and an ambulance took him to the nearest emergency room. A scan showed he had kidney stones.
Unbearable.
That $12,000 bill came in the mail a month later. At the time, Riggs didn't worry. He's a VA healthcare enrollee. Every year, he gets a letter from the government saying he has medical coverage. His VA card even tells him in an emergency to go to the nearest medical facility. So he was surprised when he got this letter from the VA.
They denied my claim because I hadn't seen one of their doctors in the last 24 months.
That's right. Veterans who don't see a VA doctor every 24 months can have their ER bill denied.
I'm being penalized for being healthy and not having to use a doctor very often.
David had seen Carol Evans' reports about other veterans' improper ER bill denials.
Sticking this veteran with a $1,200 bill, so he's now asking the question, hey, what should I do?
So David asked us to look at his denial because he'd never heard of this 24-month rule.
I had no idea that there was even a ruling like that in place.
Our investigation discovered he's not alone. According to this 2014 Government Accountability Office report, most veterans are often not aware of specific eligibility criteria and assume that VA will cover their non-VA emergency care.
Veterans are confused, and even claims people are confused.
Randy Williamson is one of the authors of the GAO report. He even testified before Congress about the problem.
That some veterans do not always understand their eligibility for coverage for emergency care.
Since that congressional testimony 3 years ago, just how many veterans has the VA denied based on that 24-month rule? Carol Evans uncovered in Minnesota alone, VA refused to pay 2,030 veterans ER bills, totaling $6.8 million. Nationwide, 219,000 ER claims were denied, putting veterans on the hook for $791 million. It leaves this federal investigator questioning whether VA followed up on his recommendations.
One of our recommendations that VA needs to do a better job informing veterans and finding out what the knowledge gaps are.
The VA declined our request for an interview and did not detail what it's currently doing to better inform veterans about the 24-month rule. But in response to our repeated requests for information on ER bill denials, a spokesman did email, VA will continue to work with veterans to help them understand their emergency care benefits.
Nobody has ever sent me any paperwork stating that this rule is in effect.
Veterans like David are now questioning if the VA is doing enough to ensure they're aware of all the hoops they need to jump through to get the medical care they earned when they put on our nation's uniform.
Well, unlike most of the other cases we've looked at where the VA was not following the law when they refused to pay for a veteran's ER bill, in this case, they are technically following the law, and David is likely stuck with that bill. Well, in response to our prior reporting on improper VA ER denials, Congress called for an Inspector General investigation, which is now underway.
Confusing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and if you have any suggestions for the KARE 11 investigative unit, go ahead and email us at investigations@kare11.com. More great reporting.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, AJ.
The guy is healthy, yet he has to.
Yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks,
Thank
AJ.
you. Good evening. We begin tonight with congressional action sparked by a KARE 11 investigation. The U.S. House of Representatives passed a bill to modernize the appeals process for VA disability claims.
The bill was introduced just days after our investigative team shared the story of a Minnesota veteran's struggle just to get someone to answer his phone calls. Investigative reporter AJ details.
Julie, Randy, back in March, we worked with a Minnesota man to expose how veterans searching for information about their benefits claims were being routed to phone lines that were either disconnected or never even answered. Well, Congress demanded action, and that Minnesota veteran's story continues to spark VA reform.
I hope you can make people aware of this.
That was veteran Bob Morris's request back in March when he shared his story about waiting more than a decade trying to get benefits for serious health problems he thinks were caused by exposure to Agent Orange in Korea.
Who would even think it would be a delay like this?
To add insult to injury, when he called the VA about a hearing date, he got one number that was disconnected and another that rang repeatedly without being answered. The very next day, Congressman Tim Walz responded, calling it a symptom of a bigger problem.
The problem is, if Bob's appeal would have been heard in a timely manner, he wouldn't be needing to make this call.
Walz, Senator Al Franken, and a Republican from California introduced a bipartisan bill to cut VA red tape, allowing private, local doctors to do disability exams and speeding the appeal process if there's a denial. This affects a lot of veterans. VA records show there's a backlog of 469,000 appeals.
I can tell you this, the appeal process is broken. That is creating an untenable backlog.
The Quicker Veterans Benefits Delivery Act of 2017 passed with broad bipartisan support in the House. The Senate still has to take it up, and as for Bob, the Minnesota vet who wanted to make people aware, I think it's safe to say he got his wish.
This week, Air Force veteran Bob Morris trudged through the Minnesota cold towards an appointment years in the making.
15 years.
He's at the Whipple Federal Building for a VA benefits appeals hearing. To get here has been a fight.
It's terrible. If it wasn't for the help of you guys, I probably never would be here yet.
Bob's battle to get this hearing was the subject of a KARE 11 investigation last spring that exposed a major disconnect at the VA.
I hope you can make people aware of this.
That was Bob's request in March when he shared his story about waiting more than a decade trying to get benefits for serious health problems.
Here is my medication drawer.
He thinks were caused by exposure to Agent Orange. When he tried calling about a hearing date, he got one number that was disconnected.
To connect to Laurel Locksmith.
And another that rang repeatedly without being answered.
I couldn't believe it, you know.
Congressman Tim Walz called it a symptom of a bigger problem.
The problem is, if Bob's appeal would have been heard in a timely manner, he wouldn't be needing to make this call.
Walz, Senator Al Franken, and a Republican congressman from California introduced a bipartisan bill to cut VA red tape, allow private local doctors to do disability exams, and speed the appeal process if there's a denial. This affects a lot of veterans. VA records showed a backlog of roughly 469,000 appeals. The bill passed in the House and is pending in the Senate, where Al Franken is listed as the only sponsor. But with today's announcement,
I will be resigning.
It raises the question, what happens to this and other important legislation Senator Franken was working on? Congressional sources tell KARE 11 it's possible, but highly unlikely any of Franken's bills would be passed after he leaves. They'll likely need to be reintroduced by another senator. But in the case of the bill to help veterans like Bob, the Senate can simply vote to pass the House version. As for Bob, who finally got his hearing, he now goes back to waiting for a ruling.
I'm saying an extra prayer today, hoping for the best.
AJ Legault, KARE 11 News.
Victory tonight for a Minnesota veteran in his long fight to get the government to take responsibility for illnesses he believes were due to exposure to Agent Orange during his military service. This is an update to a KARE 11 investigation from last year. Since then, this veteran's story has helped spark VA benefits reform legislation that President Trump recently signed into law. Here's investigative reporter AJ Legault.
This Memorial Day, Bob Morris is a man with a monument-sized weight lifted off his shoulders.
Finally, after all these years.
Flashback to March 2017.
Here is my medication drawer.
And we were sharing the Avon, Minnesota veteran's story about his more than a decade-long battle with the VA over benefits for serious health problems he strongly suspected were caused by exposure in Korea to the toxic herbicide Agent Orange.
Digging into the dirt where the Agent Orange was being sprayed.
The VA's website says veterans who served in Korea near the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, between 1968 and 1971 are presumed to have been exposed. But every time Bob tried to get benefits,
nothing but denials.
The government lost Bob's military records in a fire. But he had other proof he'd been at the DMZ. Letters from other men in his unit, and even a recording he'd mailed from Korea to his parents in St. Cloud.
I was at combat preparedness school.
Telling them about his time at the DMZ.
I fired all these things. We were up at the
DMZ? I was on the DMZ.
Determined to fight his denials, Bob repeatedly tried calling the Board of Veterans' Appeals in D.C. to find out his hearing date. But to add insult to injury, kept getting transferred to one number that was disconnected.
To connect to Laurel Locksmith.
And another.
The phone's ringing and phone's ringing.
That rang repeatedly without being answered. Carol Evans' investigation, profiling Bob's story of disconnects and denials, made waves all the way to the nation's capital.
Because this was just an outrage.
Senator Amy Klobuchar and Congressman Tim Walz both got involved.
If Bob's appeal would have been heard in a timely manner, he wouldn't be needing to make this call.
Congressman Walz introduced legislation to cut red tape and help break the VA's benefit claims backlog. President Trump recently signed that bill into law. Also because of Bob's story, an antiquated VA call center was shut down. As for Bob himself, Senator Klobuchar helped him finally get that appeals hearing he'd been waiting for.
And he had such a strong case for a disability based on his service, and yet he had to wait for years and years.
After waiting months more for a ruling,
got the letter right here.
Bob just received his answer in the mail.
Well, this is my order that my service connection for Agent Orange was granted.
Bob will now begin receiving benefits for his heart disease and diabetes, which are two of the presumptive side effects of Agent Orange exposure. He also has bladder cancer, which many in the veteran community and medical community also believe to be tied to Agent Orange. However, the VA does not yet recognize that as a direct correlation, so that fight continues.
First at 6, the latest in a KARE 11 investigation. Congress now taking action to make organ transplants easier for veterans. Thanks for joining us. A veteran who was nearly dying thanks to a series of blunders by the VA and its inability to handle his lung transplant reached out to KARE 11 from halfway across the country.
Investigative reporter A.J. Legault continues his national investigation, Distance, Delays, and Denial, and shows us how Congress is now taking action to make organ transplants easier for veterans.
Can't breathe. Just no matter how hard. Your stomach muscles hurt sometimes so bad that you feel like you've been doing sit-ups.
If Jim Thayer doesn't get a lung transplant soon, he may die.
It seems like about every 5 months I lose another 20 to 25% of the function of my lungs.
He's been waiting and waiting for a transplant.
For some reason, the VA keeps on denying that.
In these letters to members of Congress, the VA admits to numerous mistakes.
My records have been mixed up with somebody else's.
To make things even worse, the VA asked him to leave his home in Colorado and travel 1,500 miles away to Seattle for testing, one of the only 2 places in the country where vets can get lung transplants.
I just don't think this traveling back and forth is working. They need to do it at a local hospital.
In Carol Evans' original investigation from 2016, we detailed research done by Dr. David Goldberg at the University of Pennsylvania. His study focused on liver transplants and found the further away a veteran lived from a transplant center, the higher the likelihood of death.
Veterans that were more than 100 miles away from the closest transplant center are disadvantaged. They have less access to a life-saving transplant, which directly then correlates to a higher chance of dying.
Since that report aired, Congress has responded.
When we found out that veterans actually had to travel so far to get their transplants, it didn't make sense right on the face of it.
Representative Neil Dunn of Florida, a doctor who served 11 years as an Army surgeon, introduced the Veterans Increased Choice for Transplanted Organs and Recovery, or VICTOR Act of 2017. It would allow veterans who live more than 100 miles from one of the nation's VA transplant centers to seek care at a non-VA facility that covers Medicare patients.
It's better care for the veterans. Simply, they're much more likely to get a transplant. They're much more likely to have a successful transplant. And of course, that improves their survival as well.
If passed, for Thayer, the new law could mean no more trips to Seattle, where he's already gone twice, both times coming back home out of breath and without new lungs.
I don't feel like going to Seattle anymore. I don't trust them.
Well, since our Distance, Delays, and Denials investigation first aired in August of 2016, we've continued to hear from veterans like Jim from across the country with transplant horror stories. Congress is holding a hearing tomorrow on the VICTOR Act, which has bipartisan support, and Congressman Dunn tells me he thinks this bill could pass possibly through Congress by the end of the year, meaning veterans could start getting these transplants much closer to home.
Well, hopefully soon enough for this guy.
Yeah, we do know the VA is started working with him since we partnered with our sister station out in Denver to tell his story.
Yeah.
And, they've started to take some action to help
Let's
him
hope
already. So.
All right.
This is, again, one of those things that's just smart, all in the interest of the best care for our veterans.
A key vote in Congress today aimed at fixing problems exposed by a KARE 11 investigation. That report showed how sick veterans in need of organ transplants were being forced to travel long distances to get their operations.
Tonight, a major development from the nation's capital. Investigative reporter A.J. Legault joining us now with the very latest developments.
Rena, Randy, in a bipartisan vote, the U.S. House of Representatives just passed legislation late this afternoon that will allow veterans to get life-saving organ transplants closer to home. You know, it hopefully is going to fix the bureaucratic quagmire we documented in our series, Distance, Delays, and Denial.
How many patients do you think unnecessarily died because of this system?
Thousands. It's been a year since KARE 11 first broadcast this interview. A VA organ transplant manager turned whistleblower exposing problems in the VA's organ transplant program.
The problem has not been solved, period.
Instead of being allowed to get a transplant at private hospitals close to home, the VA routinely requires veterans to travel thousands of miles to one of its own transplant centers. There are 14 of them, but each one only does certain types of transplants.
It adds an insult to the injury, if you will.
This Texas Army veteran was told he had to get his lung transplant in Wisconsin.
If something doesn't go as well as we would hope, that may be where I would, where my story would end, is a long way from home.
Uprooting patients and their families isn't just inconvenient. A study published in 2014 by the University of Pennsylvania found the extended distance between veterans and their transplant facility increases the risk of death.
Was in the Army.
This Minnesota widow believes her husband's case is a prime example.
And he didn't get it.
Pam Moore's husband, John, had to repeatedly travel to a VA hospital in Texas and died waiting for a liver transplant.
My husband should have been home, not in Texas.
Congress promised to look into what we exposed. Representative Neil Dunn, a former Army surgeon, says what we'd found made no sense.
I applaud you. I read your article on the subject. Outstanding. Yeah, I didn't really realize, until you've talked to people who've been through this, it's hard to imagine that a bureaucracy actually comes up with answers like that.
Today, the U.S. House voted to approve the bill Dunn introduced, the Veterans Increased Choice for Transplanted Organs and Recovery, or VICTOR Act of 2017. It would allow veterans who live more than 100 miles from one of the nation's VA transplant centers to seek care at a non-VA facility.
Once you lay out the facts for everybody, it's pretty obvious that this is the right way to proceed.
Well, that bill now heads to the Senate, and with today's bipartisan support in the House, Congressman Dunn says he hopes it will be on President Trump's desk by the end of the year.
Good work, AJ.
Great job, AJ.
Yeah, definitely a big step today towards something that affects a lot of veterans.
Great news.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
Some troubling new medical findings mirror an issue KARE 11 has been investigating for more than a year. New research finds VA patients who need a kidney transplant experience lower transplant rates and higher death rates while on the wait list than patients with private insurance. Here's investigative reporter A.J. Legault with his continuing series, Distance, Delays, and Denial.
Was in the Army.
In the summer of 2016, KARE 11 shared the story of Pam Moore.
And he didn't get it.
The Minnesota widow's husband, John, had to repeatedly travel to a VA hospital in Texas and died waiting for a liver transplant.
My husband should have been home, not in Texas.
Instead of being allowed to get a transplant at private hospitals close to home, the VA routinely requires veterans to travel to one of its own transplant centers. There are only 14 of them, and each one only does certain types of transplants.
The problem has not been solved, period.
This VA organ transplant manager turned whistleblower told us the distance often leads to deadly delays.
How many patients do you think unnecessarily died because of this system?
Thousands.
In Ohio, at the Cleveland Clinic, research was recently published that lends credence to that allegation. It found veterans who rely on the VA are 28% less likely to actually get a transplant than those with private insurance. Dr. Joseph Augustine is the lead author.
And what we found on a national level was that VA patients had less transplant over time compared to patients with either private insurance or Medicare insurance.
A big and potentially deadly factor, the distance veterans like Aaron Arch are forced to travel. The researchers found VA patients travel a lot longer distance to get a life-saving kidney, 282 miles on average for vets, compared to just 23 miles for non-VA patients. That's 12 times further.
So the distance itself appeared to be potentially a big barrier for transplantation.
On the wake of our investigation last year, Congress promised action. A federal bill passed with broad bipartisan support in the House to allow veterans who live more than 100 miles from a VA transplant center to seek care at a non-VA facility. So far, the Senate has failed to pick that bill up. But just yesterday, the issue was again being discussed by lawmakers at the Capitol who seem to realize the current system is just not working right.
New at 6, there is a blistering new report about life-threatening problems in the VA's organ transplant program.
In a letter sent directly to President Trump, the U.S. Office of Special Counsel, the government agency that investigates whistleblower complaints, accuses the VA of failing to address issues revealed more than a year and a half ago in a KARE 11 investigation. A.J. Legault has the latest in an investigation we call Distance, Delays, and Denial.
How many patients do you think unnecessarily died because of this system?
Thousands.
His name is Jamie McBride, a whistleblower who in 2016 told us veterans needing transplants were dying needlessly because of restrictive VA rules. Minnesota veterans like John Moore, who died waiting for a liver transplant.
And he didn't get it.
Moore's widow says instead of letting him get the transplant at a private hospital here, VA rules required him to travel all the way to a VA transplant facility in Texas.
And what we found on a national level was that VA patients had less transplant over time compared to patients with either private insurance or Medicare insurance.
Medical researchers both at the Cleveland Clinic and at the University of Pennsylvania found veterans who rely on the VA for transplants are less likely to get them and more likely to die waiting than private insurance patients.
So the distance itself appeared to be potentially a big barrier for transplantation.
Now this report, sent directly to the president, found numerous shortcomings and unanswered questions in the VA's response to the problems VA whistleblower Jamie McBride detailed. It praised McBride for bringing forward the numerous barriers to life-saving organ transplants for veterans and faults the VA's response, saying it did not acknowledge the potential harm to veterans caused by delays and denials.
All in the interest of the best care for our veterans.
The U.S. House has already passed a bill to let veterans have transplants locally at private hospitals, but it still needs approval in the Senate. For KARE 11 Investigates, I'm A.J. Legault.
In response to the letter to the president, the VA sent KARE 11 a statement that says, in part, we feel OSC's assessment is ill-informed due to a lack of understanding of the general standards and practices regarding organ transplants throughout the U.S. medical community. That statement from the VA's deputy press secretary. You can read the VA's response in detail on KARE11.com.